In this video, I want to examine the versions of the causes of the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, as well as the critical flaws of the reactor installed there. The past 3 decades have slightly cooled down the polemical passions around the incident and allowed us to finally draw a balanced picture of what happened. The main question: can a similar accident happen again, or have modern nuclear plants become truly safe? Reasons. Since the accident itself, the most popular version of its cause is the so-called experimental. According to it, not very conscious personnel of the nuclear power plant decided, despite the risks, to conduct a series of experiments on reactor operation at low power, for which purpose they turned off the automatic protection systems. Without them, the experimental modes of operation resulted in a series of events that led to core overheating, explosion, and release of large quantities of radionuclides into the atmosphere. In reality, however, things were probably much more complicated. Only in 1991 to 1993 Gossatom Nadzor, and later similar foreign organizations recognized the obvious. The main problem of the Chernobyl NPP was not the experimentalists who actually performed routine, typical during scheduled repairs test operations. The true cause of the disaster was the design problems of the RBMK reactors, i.e. the channel-type high-power reactor, and the fact that the NPP personnel, with a significant probability, were never informed about one of them. The RBMK is a typical boiling water reactor, with all the drawbacks inherent in this type of system. Another capital problem of the RBMK reactors was that the absorption rods, by means of which the reactor was jammed, had an ill-conceived design. The operator, realizing 10 seconds before the explosion that the reactor was operating in a dangerous mode, gave the command to put them in. However, the rods in this reactor were designed so that when they were lowered from the extremely high position, the intensity of the chain reaction in the core was not initially reduced, as it should be, but increased. End effect. Increasing power thus even faster increases heat release in the core. The version about the fault of the personnel, which was announced immediately after the accident and fixed in the mass consciousness, was convenient because it eliminated the question of how the RBMK with 2 such severe problems went into production without any modifications, and why the nuclear department did nothing after the general designer's letter on this subject. Neutron bomb. The accident at Chernobyl in a certain sense can be seen as a mild test of a very weak neutron bomb, a weapon that until now existed only in science fiction. Unlike a conventional nuclear bomb, Chernobyl gave very little gamma radiation at the point of detonation. Most of the radioactive contamination, from 50 megacuries, came from radionuclides. Chief among them were iodine-131 and cesium-137. After the explosion in the reactor, they were released into the atmosphere and dispersed by winds across northern Ukraine, Belarus, and a number of regions in central Russia, up to Tula region. The worst role in the subsequent events was played mainly by iodine. The fact is that for terrestrial animals, this trace element is a rarity, due to which mammals have a thyroid gland accumulating it. Weighing tens of grams, it contains the bulk of all iodine in the body. Accordingly, all radioactive iodine received in the first days after the accident was also sent there. As a result, in this natural reservoir, the concentration of the extremely active radionuclide was thousands of times higher than if it had been distributed throughout the body. Once in the thyroid, iodine could lead both to partial death of thyroid cells, with subsequent hypothyroidism, and to thyroid cancer. As a result of the accident, 4,000 cases of thyroid cancer were reported between 1990 and 1998 in persons who were teenagers and lived in the contaminated area in 1986. Fortunately, it is one of the least dangerous forms of cancer, and over the same period the mortality rate among those mentioned was less than 2 per year. The short half-life of radioactive iodine, 8 days, made this threat, though potent, self-destruct rather quickly. Chances of recurrence. Parallel to the RBMK reactor that exploded later in Chernobyl, the Soviet Union was developing VVER reactors, that is water-water power reactors. Unlike the RBMK, in the VVER the water in the core does not boil, but simply remains under pressure. This allows the intensity of the chain reaction to be adjusted quickly and efficiently, simply by adding neutron-absorbing boron to it. It makes no sense to add it to the steam inside the RBMK, because the steam quickly carries the boron out of the core. VVER has a negative temperature coefficient of reactivity, i.e. as it heats up the possibility of chain reaction acceleration decreases, which protects the reactor from spontaneous power increase according to the Pripyat scenario. It also has a different cooling system. Even if the conventional active system is completely shut down, the passive cooling means, by simply dissipating heat into the surrounding space, are enough to let the core cool down. Thus, the Fukushima accident scenario, due to failure of power supply to the cooling units, for the VVER is also excluded. Similar VVER schemes dominate in the United States and France. All this means that a direct repetition of the Chernobyl and Fukushima scenarios is possible only in the still operating reactors with boiling water in the primary circuit. There are still 11 RBMKs operating in Russia, at 3 NPPs near St. Petersburg, Voronezh, and Smolensk, or American boiling water reactors. However, even there it is extremely difficult. After Chernobyl, the end effect at RBMKs was eliminated by a number of engineering modifications, and the Fukushima scenario requires extremely unusual conditions. Most countries do not build NPPs in the tsunami zone at all. Nevertheless, potential problems with nuclear power plants are quite possible as part of military scenarios. For example, during the Cold War, the option of nuclear strikes on enemy nuclear power plants was even considered. However, analysis of possible consequences of such strikes showed that the buildings of nuclear power plants are too well protected, and it would be more effective to direct a warhead at a major city. Victims. A big problem that makes it very difficult to make a balanced assessment of the consequences of the Pripyat disaster is the psychological factor. People tend to be afraid of something unusual that is not part of their everyday experience, such as processes related to the fission of the atomic nucleus. With regard to Chernobyl, the effect was further amplified by the prolonged concealment of information about the consequences of the accident. After the information blockade was lifted, the intensity of the revelations increased so much that it led to the formation of extremely exaggerated estimates. Let's start with the numbers. It is often said that the accident in one form or another affected many millions. Greenpeace estimates that it must have killed at least 93,000 people, at most 290,000, plus some 10,000 birth deformities in newborns in areas affected by the disaster. Even more restrained UN estimates for years pointed to a death toll of 9,000. It was not until many years later that other figures emerged. The final report of the World Health Organization says that fewer than 50 people died directly from the accident and the acute radiation sickness it caused. No more than 4,000 people died from the indirect effects health problems caused by radionuclides released into the atmosphere on April 26, 1986. The enormous attention given to accidents at nuclear power plants, and the main one, the Chernobyl accident, is mainly the result of psychological effect. The media is more willing to cover plane crashes rather than automobile accidents, although the former kill no more than 100 people a month worldwide, and the latter 3,000 a day. It is easier for a person to remember a small number of large events than countless small ones, even if they are dozens of times more deadly. The same has happened with nuclear power plants. Yes, they are much less dangerous than the dominant thermal power plants and hydroelectric plants, but Greenpeace will never tell you about this, and the vast majority of people will never know about it. As you know, decisions made in the world's energy industry are ultimately directed by politicians acting as ratings tell them to, not as reason tells them to. That is why Ukraine shut down Chernobyl 15 years ago, and Japan shut down all of its nuclear power plants after Fukushima. Paradoxically, it is quite probable that the accident at Chernobyl and the related cooling of interest in nuclear power plants around the world eventually indirectly killed not 4,000 people, but much more, and continues to kill them every year. According to existing estimates, if the entire thermal generation of the world were replaced by nuclear power by 2010, the French scenario, this would avoid several million deaths by 2050. The accident at Chernobyl, which dealt the main blow to the expansion of nuclear power, is largely to blame for the deaths of these millions. In the final analysis, it is this, largely purely psychological, side of Chernobyl that should be assessed as the most deadly. If you are interested, do not be lazy, give me a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any more interesting videos on my channel. Hit bell to notify me and share this video with your friends. What else interesting things can you add to this video? Write in the comments, it will be interesting to read.